Hello guys, this is your friend Naruto What If Hub 2.0 and we are back in new fanfic. What if Naruto was in Team 8? The legendary fanfic part 3. Hinata was still a little shaky when she arrived at the Hyuga compound. Kurenai-sensei suggested that they should forego their normal evening training and make sure they got a full night's sleep. Depending on their assignment, they may have to set out immediately. Though she understood the reasons, Hinata was disappointed that she and Naruto wouldn't get to eat the dinner she'd packed that morning. She thought the shiitake udon had come out rather well, and she wanted to see Naruto's face when he tasted it. Perhaps she could pack some for their journey to the border. Though she'd come home earlier than usual, the main house was still quiet. Her father must be occupied with the village council again. She felt herself relax for a moment before she realized what she was doing and chided herself for her disrespect. He was still her father, and it was unseemly for her to be glad at his absence. Worse, he would probably detect her disloyal feelings when he returned, and it would be his duty to punish her for failing to show proper respect. Hinata. Her father's voice interrupted her thoughts, and she hated herself for the way she jumped. Her fear was unworthy of a Hyuga, though, and savored the memories of the kind-hearted woman who'd treasured her only daughter. Of course, that made it difficult to fight with Hanabi. One look at those eyes, no matter how angry they seemed, always softened her hands. Her heartache and longing for the only person who seemed to understand her, to treasure her, had no place in the sparring ring. Nevertheless, they intruded constantly, sapping her will to fight. No matter how disappointed her father became with her, Hinata couldn't force herself to hate her sister, to strike her down as he demanded during their sparring matches. So it was inevitable that Hanabi would triumph against her larger, but mostly passive, sister. Father had first been amazed at Hanabi's prowess, and it lifted Hinata's heart a little to see her sister smile as she basked under father's praise. But eventually his surprise turned to disappointment in his oldest daughter, who could not hold her own against a girl several years her junior. Hanabi continued to work hard, thriving under father's amazed tutelage, while Hinata was always more and more of a disappointment. Today was no different from any other, though perhaps Hanabi's expression was a little more fierce than usual. Hinata briefly wondered about this, before her father's voice derailed her train of thought. I am to understand, he said in a low voice, if certain members of Anbu are to be believed, that you played a role in the capture of a spy today. Hinata's heart contracted into a hard lump at the patina of frost that overlaid her father's words. She'd thought about telling him herself when she saw him, hoping he would be proud of her. But he'd already heard about it, and did not seem happy at the news. Hi, she said in a faltering voice. I am told, he continued, emphasizing the last word, that you utilized an advanced technique to disable your opponent. Anyo, my teammates also, she began. I do not care about them, her father snapped. And you will not speak of that low-born trash again. It is your behavior that reflects on our clan, not theirs. Hanabi, assume a guard position. Hanabi made a half-turn, moving smoothly into a basic Jiyuken defensive stance. Her eyes bored into Hinata's and Hinata knew her sister did not like the news she had heard. Hinata, you will now demonstrate this technique of yours, her father commanded. Hinata stared at her sister and swallowed. She remembered the state of mind she'd been in, the determination to stop her foe or die trying, the determination to not let her team down, the determination to show Naruto what she could do. She felt none of that now, in front of the cold eyes of her family, quailing before the rage and something else burning in her sister's eyes. Was it fear? Hinata did not want to hurt her, even for father. Otu-san, as I suspected, he said coolly, your role in this was exaggerated, possibly in a misguided attempt to curry favor with the clan. I knew you were weak, Hinata, but to find that you lack honor as well. This is very disappointing. Gomen, Otu-san, but I did not know you were told of, Hinata's voice trailed off. She didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want to have to attack her sister's tenketsu points. Hinata wasn't even sure she could do it now if she wanted to. That moment in the street, she'd briefly possessed a moment of sublime clarity. And now she felt like she was veiled in heavy fabric, closing in her vision, muffling her voice, stifling her breathing. Maybe it was better that her father didn't know of it. Her moment was brief and had now passed. She let out an inaudible sigh and hung her head. Hanabi's quiet snort of contempt was all the more noticeable. Perhaps you did not know of that, Hiyashi allowed. The constriction in her chest loosened a little and she dared look up again. But it is important that you and Hanabi be made aware of the differences between the basic Jiyuken techniques you use, and the truly advanced moves used by those who mastered more of our clan's style. Neji will assist me in demonstrating some of these techniques for you. His eyes hardened. We will take all night if it is necessary. Anyo, Otu-san, Hinata said quickly, tightening her fingers on the hem of her jacket to keep them from shaking. I have been instructed to prepare tonight for a mission of at least a week's duration. The dojo was deadly quiet, and in the stillness, Hinata thought she might have sensed Neji's left eyebrow move a millimeter upward. Her father's voice was as hard as a kunai and would brook no compromise. Then you had better learn quickly, he said in an emotionless voice, that to Hinata's practiced ear carried the overtones of a snarl. Aburame Shino returned home to find his father and mother waiting for him. As it was a little early for his father to be home, he regarded them with a raised eyebrow. Mother, father, he greeted them with a deferential nod. Aburame Shibi regarded his son with a neutral expression, his eyes hidden behind equally dark glasses. One of my colleagues, he said quietly, informed me of your actions earlier today. I see, Shino said. The Anbu were quite impressed, his father continued. Your Kikai Bunshin was apparently flawless, and proved capable of deceiving a Jonin. The direction of your allies afterward was precise and timely, and their positioning above the thoracic vertebrae made quick removal impossible. Our relatives are quite impressed with your skill. More importantly, his mother interrupted, smiling broadly, we're proud of you. Misato was not a typical member of the Aburame clan. This made sense, as she was a kunoichi his father had met on a diplomatic mission to the hidden village of Mist. She was, however, as fascinated with insects as the rest of his relatives, and her, mantis-style, fighting, using twin serrated blades that mimicked the claws of a praying mantis, had evidently intrigued the enigmatic Konoha shinobi. Despite common interests, Misato was different. She actually smiled occasionally, and was far more emotionally demonstrative than the other members of a very reserved and dignified clan. Shino noted that his father neither encouraged nor discouraged these displays of sentiment, but his attention always seemed fixed upon her while they were happening, which was probably enough by itself. From listening to conversations he was supposedly too young to understand, Shino realized that many Aburames were less than sanguine about having one of their clan's most gifted practitioners marrying someone outside the bloodline. However, Shino's rapid development banished their fears, and led to his father raising a mildly sardonic eyebrow and remarking upon hybrid vigor. But Shino had better things to do than bask in his parents' regard, no matter how pleasant. Unanswered questions nagged at the back of his mind, like splinters embedded in flesh, and only answers would give relief. I appreciate your sentiments, but the role I played in the capture was largely peripheral. While I did drain the subject's chakra reserves, Uzumaki Naruto made the original interception and assault, while Hyuga Hinata performed the actual takedown. Your modesty and sense of teamwork do you credit, his father observed. Shino nodded almost imperceptibly. Perhaps. I have been surprised at Naruto's progress in his training, especially with the expectations I had gleaned from others, both in and out of the academy, he observed coolly. As expected, both of his parents flinched a little at the import of his words, and glanced at each other. If you have first-hand knowledge of something, his father said carefully, it is probably better to rely upon that, instead of second-hand observations. My question is the source of those second-hand observations, Shino replied, bearing down on the cause of his mental distractions of late. His mother grimaced and rolled her eyes. I think I'll see about dinner, she said as she left the room, shaking her head. Shino was left with his father, who seemed unusually agitated, for an Aburame, at least. Finally, he sighed and actually grimaced himself, the rare expression curling his thin mustache. There are restrictions placed around certain pieces of information. As a resident of Konoha, I am required to honor those restrictions. In light of your observations these last few weeks, I will allow that the implications of certain facts may have been misinterpreted or exaggerated. You are picking your words with great care, Shino observed. Correct, his father agreed. I am attempting to avoid committing a capital offense. Shino didn't even bother trying to keep his eyebrows from rising above his glasses. Unlike some hidden villages, there were not a lot of laws in Konoha that carried a death penalty. Outright treason could merit such a punishment, but what would that have to do with his teammate? None of this made sense, but it wasn't surprising that he couldn't puzzle out the meaning, not if he wasn't even allowed to see all the pieces. Given what you know, that I do not, he asked, what would you do in my place? His father seemed to relax a little, though an outsider would have been hard-pressed to notice the difference. I would continue as you have, keeping your eyes open. If you perchance discover something unusual, remember what I said about first-hand knowledge being superior. I will attempt to keep that in mind, Shino promised. Naruto stayed behind for a moment as his teammates left. Kurenai looked at him curiously as he cleared his throat. Anyo, Kurenai-sensei, I was wondering about our pay for this afternoon. She nodded toward the opened envelope in Naruto's hands. Yes, that is normally done for higher-ranked missions. Given their simplicity and lack of risk, D-rank missions are usually paid out of the Hokage's petty cash. But for higher-ranked missions, they often do not have the funds on hand required to pay the shinobi. So they use vouchers like you have there. It's just a slip of paper, stamped with the Hokage's seal, but any bank or moneylender in Konoha will redeem it for the amount listed. A simple jutsu bound to the seal will consume it instantly if anyone tries to alter it. Naruto nodded intently as she explained the reasons for the vouchers, but as she finished he sighed and his shoulders seemed to slump. I wonder if old man Ichiraku can, he muttered. Their first significant delay occurred outside the bank itself. Two large, brawny men in heavy armor and carrying naganatas were on duty at the entrance. Their size and equipment were intended more to deter casual thieves than real shinobi, but their bladed pole arms were blocking the entrance. You are still open, she observed coolly, I can see customers inside. You may enter, the one on the left said gruffly, but not him. Naruto flinched a little, seemingly in spite of himself, and Kurenai felt even more ashamed of her village. But now was not the time for softer emotions. You tread a dangerous path, she hissed. This boy was just rewarded by the Hokage for intercepting an enemy Jonin that had outrun the Anbu. The spy is now back at the tower, entertaining Ibiki. She used the interrogation specialist's name quite deliberately, and was gratified to see the grown men shudder at her words, even as Naruto scratched his head. Be that as it may, the older one on the right said slowly, we have specific orders regarding the boy. Kurenai frowned. These men could lose their positions if they disobeyed a direct order, but who would issue such a command? Previously, the animosity toward the Jinchuriki seemed to be more personal and unorganized. Was someone attempting to provoke Naruto into doing something that would discredit him in the eyes of the village, and perhaps cost him the Hokage's protection? I think I understand, she said slowly. Your superiors may be concerned about a prank of some sort. I can assure you that this is a legitimate task, and that he will perform no pranks within this building. You have my word as a Jonin that I will assume full responsibility for his behavior inside. She hoped they would seize upon this pretext to placate their superiors. The two guards glanced at each other for a moment. Then the older one nodded and they each moved their naginata aside, breathing a sigh of relief. Noting that, Kurenai realized that she'd been bringing considerable amounts of killer intent to bear on them. Her anger at Naruto's treatment had become stronger, rather than weaker, over time, but she was still mildly surprised at this lapse in control. Even if it had made convincing them to accept her word easier, it was still unprofessional. Naruto was on his best behavior as they entered, looking around curiously. The decor was understated, but a bit nicer than most of the stores he'd likely seen. She guided them toward the counter when the second delay, in the form of the manager, stepped into their path. "I am sorry, Madam Uehi," the unctuous middle-aged man said, using a form of address that Kurenai did not appreciate, "but as it is late in the day, we are not opening new accounts at this time. I understand that there is another bank, not far from here, that remains open." The man's smile was just a little too smug, and Kurenai could already guess where this would go. They would get redirected from bank to bank, branch to branch, until they were left with a seedy moneylender who charged usurious rates, or simply gave up in disgust. "Very well," she snapped, "clear out my account, bring me the funds, in cash, and I will return to the Hokage's tower to inform him that his vouchers are no longer accepted at your bank." The manager paled suddenly. As a moderate workaholic with modest tastes in a house she'd inherited from her parents, Kurenai's savings were considerable. In cash, it would be an inconvenient mass, but she didn't really care at this point. Besides, people walking out of a bank with unusually large amounts of coin tended to spawn rumors that there was something wrong, rumors that could become self-fulfilling prophecies if they started a run on the bank. Especially if the other shinobi heard he had refused a voucher. Now the man looked trapped, and Kurenai really wanted to know why. "I'm sure that will not be necessary," he said quickly. "Then we should get started immediately," Kurenai replied in a deceptively mild tone. "I don't want to keep your subordinates here too long, but we both leave for a mission in the morning." The manager appeared to be thinking for a moment, but then nodded suddenly. "As all of my employees are helping customers, I will assist you myself." Kurenai was suspicious of his suddenly cooperative mood, but allowed them both to be led to his office. The actual process to set up a basic account was fairly simple. Naruto just needed to sign several legal documents, none of which he bothered to read first. While Kurenai supposed she should be touched by his trust in her, she resolved to discuss with him the proper way to analyze a legal document, preferably before signing them. If, no, she corrected herself, when he became Hokage, he would need to be very careful in what he signed. As they finished the documents, Naruto reluctantly handed over the pay voucher that had prompted this entire expedition. The manager's eyes widened a little when he saw the sum written by the Hokage's hand. The Sandaime had been generous, but he was correct that it was less than he would have expended on a hunter nin squad if the spy had escaped. Looking at the manager, she decided to grind the kunai into the bone a little more. Taking out her own voucher, she left it on his desk while she plucked a deposit envelope from the stack. Seemingly of their own volition, the man's eyes wandered over to her slip, allowing him to see that it was the same size as Naruto's. Smiling sweetly, Kurenai nodded. The Hokage was quite generous, but Naruto and his team did intercept a Jonin who'd stolen scrolls from the Hokage's tower, and was successfully evading an entire Anbu squad. Naruto intercepted him, and his teammates finished him off well before the Anbu arrived. Looking directly into the man's eyes, she gestured at her voucher. "All before I could do anything. I got that just for training them." The Hokage was so impressed, he didn't even care that they'd beaten me to the punch. The manager now looked almost nauseous with fear. Kurenai was tempted to arrange for a loud, sudden sound, just to see if he would flee in terror. She glanced over at her student. Naruto's prankster spirit appeared to be rubbing off on her in some ways she hadn't anticipated. For his own part, Naruto's face was pink from her words. He scratched at the back of his head and cracked a nervous grin. "Anyo, sensei, you say too much. All you did, Kurenai interjected, was volunteer to make the initial interception. Facing a fresh enemy, that's the most dangerous role. Not only did you stop him, but you also damaged him so he could no longer get away from us or the Anbu." Naruto shrugged. I'm supposed to protect my teammates, right? Kurenai smiled at her student. He'd embraced his role within the team to a greater degree than she'd hoped. Hinata was inevitable, she supposed, all her machinations aside, but he was also seeking to protect Shino as well. You are exactly correct, Uzumaki-san, she replied in a formal tone, making the boy blush again. Turning to their somewhat dumbstruck audience of one, her voice lost some of its warmth. Is there anything else? She asked. The manager shook his head quickly, but Naruto spoke up. Sensei, this puts all of the voucher thing in my account, correct? What if I want to keep some of the money myself? The money in your account belongs to you as well, Kurenai clarified. And you can pull out as much of it as you want at any time. When you deposit a voucher, you can request that a portion of it be given to you as cash. How much should I deposit and how much should I keep? He asked. Kurenai noticed that when he was trying to wrestle with an unfamiliar concept, Naruto tended to tune out everything else. Right now he was totally focused on her, ignoring the manager who'd angered them so much earlier. Kurenai found it a particularly satisfying experience as a teacher, to have such an attentive student hanging on her words. Those fools at the academy, she mused. You should, at a minimum, try to save at least a third of what you make, and try not to touch it except for emergencies. If you can, save more, Kurenai answered, her voice trailing off as she wondered how best to explain what she wanted to say. It's like carrying kunai, she continued after a moment. How many is a Konoha shinobi required to carry? 3 for active duty, Naruto replied automatically, his voice taking on the sing-song tone of a well-memorized fact. Well, Iruka would at least make sure he was well grounded in the basics, she mused. And how many do you carry, Naruto? Well, he hesitated, glancing at the manager, a lot more. Kurenai smiled slightly at his caution with an operational secret. Another test passed. And why is that, Naruto? Because you never know when you might need more than 3, he said, shrugging. Then his eyes widened as he made the connection. So money is like kunai? He asked. She nodded. Correct. It's better to have more than you need than not enough. And since we are leaving for a mission tomorrow, you likely will not need much money in your pockets, will you? I would deposit all of that, and then when you return, you will have another voucher waiting for you. I imagine you'll be eager to visit Ichiraku at that point, yes? Naruto nodded eagerly as he filled out the deposit slip and slid his voucher into the stiff paper. When he finished, he looked up expectantly. Very good, Naruto, Kurenai said approvingly. When we return to Konoha, I will show you how to use an account register so you can keep track of your money. For right now, I need to have a few words with the manager about my account. You should probably have a good supper and try to get to sleep early. We'll be getting an early start tomorrow, remember we are meeting at the Hokage's tower at 9. Don't be late. When the genin left the office, Kurenai returned her attention to the manager, who had partially regained his composure. Explain yourself, she snapped. I do not know what you mean, the man stammered, taken off guard by her abrupt change in demeanor. You attempted to refuse service to a Konoha shinobi who has done nothing to you and yours. He was nearly killed this afternoon protecting shopkeepers and merchants from an enemy jonin who was entirely too careless with explosive tags. Now, when he's trying to cash in his reward, given directly to him by the Hokage, you try to turn us away. Rudeness and abuse he is all too familiar with, but this is different, isn't it? You knew if he went to another bank, he'd get the same treatment, didn't you? Kurenai's red eyes bored into the watery brown ones possessed by the manager, and below the edge of his desk, her fingers quickly formed the seals she needed. The genjutsu she cast was a fairly subtle one, designed to get the truth from those who did not wish to reveal it. It didn't force the subject to speak, but it inspired a certain terror of the caster, and a profound fear of being caught in a lie. Its effectiveness was inversely proportional to the subject's strength of will, making it nearly useless on shinobi, and she knew someone like Ibiki would consider it an effeminate substitute for his interrogation skills. On the other hand, if the seals were concealed from view, the subject might not even be aware he'd been placed under a genjutsu. Of course, using it on a Konoha citizen was rather questionable, and something that could have earned her a long explanation with the Konoha military police, before they were decimated. At the least, it would still earn her an interview with the Hokage if it were discovered. On the other hand, she felt that her observations gave her probable cause to expect that there was some sort of organized resistance to Naruto's presence in Konoha. As that was an attempt to subvert the spirit, if not the letter of the Hokage's law concerning the boy, she felt that she could skate on that issue if it came down to it. The manager's words dispelled these concerns in an instant. I didn't know for sure, but I did suspect, he answered nervously, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else but talking to this furious Kunoichi. There was a gathering of the bankers and moneylenders after the last village council meeting. Our representative to the council of elders said that we were to discourage the boy from patronizing our establishments. If he became violent in any way when refused service, we were to call Anbu immediately. I see, Kurenai said, but she really didn't. And why this sudden change in policy? I do not know, the man said, sagging fearfully. Many people in our guild would prefer not having him in Konoha, he said hesitantly. But I think this originally came from the council, he added. Very well, Kurenai said, releasing the subtle genjutsu as she stood up. I would carefully consider whether you wish to involve yourself in this vendetta some elder seems to have against the boy. He's ambitious, he works harder than anyone his age, and he's gained the attention of the Sandaime and several senior shinobi with his actions today. He swears he will be Hokage someday, and damned if I don't think he might realize his dream. That will not bode well for anyone that stood in his path to the tower. I will be showing him how to keep track of his account, and for your sake there had better be no irregularities in his balance, or I will personally destroy you. Have I made myself clear? The man nodded quickly, so Kurenai spun on her heel and stalked out of the office. After dinner, she'd likely be throwing kunai at the old stump behind her house for an hour before she would be able to sleep. That actually wasn't a bad idea, she reflected as she stepped out onto the street. She needed to do some thinking. Something had changed in Konoha, and she needed to understand what it was, how it would affect her charges, and ultimately her own plans. The manager, his mind still reeling from the aftereffects of terror, could only nod dumbly at the Jonin's warning. He breathed a sigh of relief as she left his office. After several minutes regaining his composure, he shakily rose to his feet. Clutching the documents the two had signed like a life preserver, he made his way to the central counting room to make sure both transactions were entered into the books accurately. He would just report that the boy's Jonin hadn't given him any choice in the matter and threatened to report him directly to the Hokage. No one would blame him in that case. And he would also make sure that Yuichi Kurenai never had cause to speak to him again. With no evening training scheduled, Naruto decided that a leisurely dinner at Ichiraku's was just what the medic nin ordered. Surprisingly, the old man had heard about the disturbance downtown, and knew his best customer had been involved. Naruto blinked at the idea of villagers talking about him, and not in the hateful manner he was accustomed to. At that point, there was nothing to be done but to give a blow-by-blow account of the battle. To his credit, he dwelled as much on his teammates' exploits as his own. In particular, he was impressed by whatever the heck Hinata had done. He'd rolled out of the wreckage right as the Jonin reached her, so he'd seen clearly what she did, but that didn't help him understand. He'd never seen her use a technique like that before. Even as hyped up and excited as he'd been from the fighting, her hands were still small white blurs to his eyes. And when she was done, the Jonin just dropped to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. Old man Ichiraku smiled as the boy described his teammates' attacks with wild gestures, sound effects, gushing praise. You know, he observed, times have changed. When I was your age, girls impressed boys with a pretty kimono, or an elaborate hairstyle with bejeweled pins. Now they do it by beating the hell out of people. He sighed theatrically, suppressing a laugh as Naruto's eyes bulged out comically. Maybe it's different for Kunoichi, he continued. It's probably cheaper than spending all that money on finery. He laughed, earning a dirty look from Ayame as she set another bowl down in front of blushing Naruto. It's not like that, Naruto protested. She's really good. She works super hard and will do whatever it takes to improve herself. She's probably upset we didn't get to train tonight. It's like, his voice trailed off as he thought for a moment, chewing the hot noodles. Kurenai was trying to teach him how to look underneath the underneath, but it was awfully hard to do it all the time. It's like she has something to prove, he finally said. Then he nodded. I think that's exactly it, but I don't know what she's trying to prove, or to who. The old man gave him a vaguely superior smile that made Naruto nervous for some reason. I'm sure you'll figure it out, eventually, Naruto. Another bowl of miso. Naruto nodded as his chopsticks moved in a blur. A few moments later he put them down and lifted the bowl, draining the savory liquid. He looked up as a familiar presence sat down next to him. Ohio, Iruka-sensei, he said, greeting his former teacher. Hello, Naruto, the Chunin said with a smile. I see you got started without me. He'd treated Naruto to a few bowls of ramen since their ordeal in the forest with Mizuki. They didn't talk much about what had been said that night, but they didn't really seem to need to. My treat tonight, sensei. Naruto said happily. Kurenai's lessons on propriety and etiquette were not completely wasted on the genin. He understood that it wasn't appropriate for him to empty Iruka's wallet every time they met. Iruka's eyebrows raised in surprise. What is the occasion? He asked curiously. Naruto shrugged. I just felt like I should pay sometimes. Besides, I got a good bonus today. Oh, Iruka asked. We were coming back from our first D-rank mission, and we saw some Anbu chasing this guy. Naruto's voice lowered as he launched into a retelling of the day's battle, this time using more ninja terminology that Iruka would understand. When he was done, the young man sat on his stool in shock, a bowl of beef ramen cooling untouched before him. I heard that Kurenai-sama had been involved in the capture, but not her genins, he whispered, his voice trailing off. Then his eyes hardened, drawing the scar across the bridge of his nose tight. What the hell was she thinking, letting you fight a jonin? He demanded, suddenly furious. Naruto blinked, eyes wide. He'd rarely seen Iruka really lose his temper like this, not the mock exasperation he used on recalcitrant students at the Konoha Ninja Academy. Sensei, she didn't order us to attack. She was going to have us hide behind a genjutsu, but we were already moving before she realized, he explained, his words stumbling over each other. Then this was your idea? Iruka demanded, but his voice had lost most of its harshness. What were you thinking? He could have killed all of you. Now it was Naruto's turn to frown. Not really, he claimed. It was actually pretty easy, since we'd worked it out ahead of time. Easy? Iruka asked incredulously. You could have been incinerated when those tags went off. Naruto shook his head. I knew that guy liked to make explosions, so if I couldn't get clear, I was ready to do a Kawarimi no Jutsu and swap with one of my cage bunchins. Iruka's eyebrows went up. You can swap with one of your clones? He asked, clearly impressed. Naruto nodded. It's pretty easy, he answered, since we're already the same shape. Yes, but usually the jutsu will disrupt the clone before it can complete, Iruka clarified. Your bunshin must be very sturdy, he observed, frowning. Naruto shrugged. If I'm concentrating the right way when I mold the chakra, it takes a pretty solid blow to destroy them. He nodded thanks to Ayame when she replaced his bowl. He took a big bite of noodles while they were still hot, enjoying the texture while Iruka sat staring into the distance. After he swallowed, he poked his former teacher in the shoulder, startling him. Your ramen is getting cold, he reminded him with a cheeky grin. Besides, everything went according to plan. Plan? Iruka asked as he began eating his ramen. Shino, Hinata, and I worked out ahead of time how we would stop someone who was carrying vital information. I would intercept and slow him down, Shino would drain off his chakra, and Hinata would take him down with her Jiyuken, Naruto explained, smiling. That was the plan and it worked out just right. Uruka shook his head as he swallowed. I still have trouble believing you attacked a Jonin head-on, he admitted. Well, my clones did the first attack, he admitted. This guy wasn't a big taijutsu specialist, not like Guy Sensei or Lee. I understand he was more of a sneaking around guy. He shrugged. If he'd handled my clones like Guy, or even Lee, I'd have had to improvise, you know. Yes, Naruto, but even a Chunin should have been. Now Uruka's eyes narrowed again. You mentioned doing some extra training with Guy and Lee, how much have you been training? Naruto shrugged as he drained the broth from another bowl. 3 hours every morning since the day after I left the academy. Guy explains taijutsu a lot better than Mizuki ever did, he answered, his mouth twisting with distaste at the mention of the traitor who deceived him and nearly killed both of them. Uruka's eyes had gone wide. How do you have time to train with your team, or do missions? He asked incredulously. As Naruto matter-of-factly explained his daily routine, Uruka's ramen was left untouched as his eyes grew wider. When he was done, the Chunin stood abruptly, excused himself and left. I'm sorry, Naruto, he said, I just remembered something I forgot to do, and I need to take care of it immediately, he explained. Thank you for the ramen. He marched off with an angry expression on his face that confused Naruto. Then the blonde-haired boy shrugged and ordered a bowl of pork ramen. He needed to fortify himself for a very long period of ramen-less patrolling. Ooh. Kurenai managed to vent most of her frustrations on an unoffending stump in her backyard when she heard the bell at the front gate to her property. The cottage on the outskirts of Konoha was fairly modest. Her parents were middle-class merchants before they were killed in a fire while staying at an inn, so it only took a few moments for her to walk around to the front. It wasn't hard for her to recognize the shadowy figure standing under the lantern hanging from the gate post. She'd wondered when he'd be showing up. Yumi no Uruka, she said by way of greeting. Kurenai-sama, the Chunin said shortly. What brings you here? She asked. If he was going to be that way, she'd match his directness. Naruto, he said coldly. Ah, she replied. Would you like to come inside? She asked. Uruka nodded, and she opened the gate and led him up the stone-lined path to the front porch. They were silent as they removed their sandals at the door, and Kurenai hung the bandolier of practice kunai on a hook. Uruka accepted a seat in her living room, while she retired to the kitchen to prepare tea. While her parents had preferred Western-influenced architecture for their home, Kurenai grew up in a household with very traditional customs. As such, a guest was not entertained without some offer of refreshment. Besides, making tea gave her a chance to think, even as it gave Uruka a chance to cool off. The Chunin did seem somewhat more composed as he accepted his tea with a polite nod. Kurenai decided to wait him out. That put her into a marginally stronger position and increased the odds that she could convince him to cooperate, or at least not interfere. She knew Naruto was close to his old teacher, one of the first adults to accept him for what he was, instead of what they feared he was. Her interview with the man shortly after her team was assigned revealed that his feelings for the boy were genuine, and not feigned. But, he was also a worrier. He knew Naruto had not received the best training at the Konoha Ninja Academy, and practically begged her to take it easy on him, and not expose him to undue risks. Knowing this, she knew he could not have been happy with Naruto's involvement in the skirmish earlier that day. Kurenai knew she needed this man on her side, with regards to Naruto's training and development. She knew from her studies that the boy needed some sort of male role model. The Sandaime was far too remote to serve in that role, and Uruka was far more suitable than Maida Guy. If she could not convince him of the rightness of her actions, his influence on Naruto would act counter to hers, perhaps sapping the boy's determination to succeed, and she could not have that. So she waited, observing his demeanor from the corner of her eye, and silently marshaled her arguments. Naruto treated me to dinner tonight, Iruka began. He was quite proud of himself after he and two other genins fought a jonin. His emphasis on the last word made it sound like a particularly vile epithet. They nearly stopped my heart when I realized they were not behind me, Kurenai admitted in a wry voice, visibly startling Iruka. Like you, she continued, I did not think they were ready for such a challenge. Usually, when I have those thoughts, I am quickly proven wrong, but I would not casually gamble with their lives. They were already moving to engage before I could stop them. I see, Iruka murmured. I am glad that you were not encouraging them to take such risks. But when I asked Naruto why he was so confident, he mentioned his training schedule. Is there a reason to work the boy so hard? Kurenai nodded. The question was valid, and she needed to answer it if she wanted the Chunin's support. What would he be doing if he is not training? Iruka started to answer, but then stopped. Kurenai knew that most genins liked to spend time with their families, or with their friends. But Naruto didn't have the first and possessed very few of the latter. It was no wonder he'd begun pulling pranks, he'd had no other way to occupy his time. Iruka sighed and changed his approach. Aren't you afraid of burning him out with all this? Kurenai nodded. If he were any other genin, I would say yes in a minute. But for the first time in his life, he has people explaining things to him, showing him exactly how to do things, and he is seeing daily progress instead of redoubled frustration. She held up her hand as Iruka scowled and opened his mouth. I know you actually tried to help him, but you were only one of many teachers, in a place he'd already learned to associate with boredom and ridicule. I'm amazed he learned as much from you as he did, under those conditions. Iruka nodded slowly as he seemed to consider her words with care. But will making him stronger really make him happy? He finally asked. Kurenai let out a sigh of her own. I hope so, she said with a bit more candor than she'd intended. Iruka's unexpected open-mindedness prompted a more frank response than she might have preferred. But trust was a two-way street between shinobi. It had to be given as well as received. You know of his grand ambition. Iruka nodded, smiling faintly. The first step to achieving that goal, she said calmly, lies in becoming as proficient a shinobi as possible, and as quickly as possible. Iruka's eyebrows lifted in an almost comical fashion. You really think Uzumaki Naruto will become Hokage? Eventually, Kurenai asked. I think anything is possible. Someone will have to follow Sarutobi. He's very wise, but he won't live forever. I don't see any strong candidates for his successor, do you? Iruka slowly shook his head. Not like the fourth was. No one stands out the way he did. I think Konoha could do much worse than someone like Naruto, Kurenai said quietly. He has a kind heart and a determination to do the right thing. I have seen this in the way he trains, and the way he treats his teammates. The only thing I am unsure of is whether he will even want to be Hokage by the time he is ready, or if he will have come to hate the village by then. Iruka looked crestfallen as Kurenai related her experiences trying to get Naruto properly equipped. He was visibly shocked as she related the Hokage's words about the recalcitrant villagers, and how they circumvented the spirit of the Hokage's law, even while conforming to the letter. He rubbed his chin as she related what she'd learned at the bank, not even reacting when she mentioned using the interrogation genjutsu on the manager. I will investigate this while you are gone on this patrol mission, he said absently. Maybe I can uncover who is trying to drive Naruto from Konoha. If this action did originate on the village council, then the identities of the plotters should be difficult to conceal. That would be good to know, she agreed. She was a little surprised that he'd come around to her viewpoint so quickly. He displayed an unusual degree of mental flexibility, especially for a man. Well, I'd better be going. I have class in the morning, and you have a mission to prepare for, he said, standing up. Thank you for the tea, he said formally. I'm glad we had this talk, she said as she led him to the front door. With his sandals on, Iruka lingered in her doorway for a moment. He opened his mouth a couple of times, only to close it. Please, take care of Naruto, he finally said in a small voice. I will do all that I can, she replied. She wished she could make a more positive reply, but past experience had shown her that good intentions and a strong will couldn't guarantee anything, no matter how desperately one might want them to. Good night, Iruka said in a somber voice, bowing slightly. Kurenai watched him turn and walk off into the darkness. Ooh, Naruto had gotten to the point where he awoke before his alarm more than half the time. Avoiding painful shocks seemed to be a more than sufficient motivator for his subconscious. He dressed quickly and hefted the heavy backpack he'd so carefully loaded the night before. Then he locked up his apartment and headed for his daily meeting with Guy-sensei and Lee. Maida Guy had already heard about the previous day's fight, but asked that Naruto tell it again from his viewpoint. By the time the blonde shinobi had finished, Lee was practically vibrating. Yes, Naruto-san, you have shown everyone the power of your youth. The genin with the bowl cut shouted, leaping up with one fist punching the air. Naruto winced and rubbed at his ear. Yeah, I guess we did, a little, he agreed with a grin. Lee's eyes were lit with a strange fire when he turned to his teacher. Guy-sensei, do you think there will be another attempt to steal the Hokage's scroll? Maybe we could patrol around the tower and catch the next one. Guy looked a bit alarmed at this, and Naruto quickly cleared his throat. Lee, I don't think that's such a good idea, he said quickly. If a stealth specialist was caught, they might send someone who's more of a generalist or heavy combat type next time. Also, remember I was with my whole team at the time, and they did a lot of the work. Yes, Guy exclaimed, giving Naruto a thumbs up. Naruto has demonstrated that he knows the true meaning of teamwork, Lee. Then his brows lowered dramatically as he turned fully toward Lee. He understands that a team can do far more than an individual alone. Do not seek the path of false glory, Lee. Trust your sensei to steer you correctly. Lee immediately burst into tears and began sobbing apologies to his teacher as Naruto broke out into a cold sweat. After two overly passionate choruses of, Guy-sensei, Lee, Naruto loudly cleared his throat. The green spandex-clad shinobis looked up from their tearful embrace. The Hokage said he's going to send us on a C-rank patrol mission now, and I need to report to the Hokage's tower by 9. I wanted to let you know that I'll be out of the village for at least a few days, Naruto said, struggling to keep his voice even. Guy nodded thoughtfully as Lee regained his composure. We will await your return. Try to train as much as you can while you are away. You've made good progress here, Naruto, and it would be a shame to see you lose your edge while you are gone. Naruto barked, hi, and made a quick bow to the man who, however odd, had nonetheless demystified taijutsu for him. Guy smiled at the genin. I understand that you may have a long journey, so we will do something different today. I will discuss tactics for dealing with multiple opponents, and afterward, perhaps you can help Lee with your cage bunchins. Naruto hadn't had a chance to use any jutsus in his matches with Lee before now, so his grin was just a bit feral. Lee looked from his sensei to his sparring partner and swallowed. Ooh, Naruto was still smiling as he walked toward the Hokage's tower. The lesson had been good, and he'd be thinking about what Guy said about fighting multiple opponents for a while. The tactics varied, using terrain, using your opponents themselves, but usually they involved arranging things so you only fought a few enemies at a time. It was also fun to let Lee see him do something he was really good at. The genin's eyes practically popped out of his head when 30 Narutos charged him with a chorus of battle cries. Even Guy had seemed a little impressed. According to him, Naruto coordinated exceptionally well with his bunshin. Naruto enjoyed the praise, but tried not to let it go to his head. Kurenai-sensei would be sure to notice and bring it to his attention before she deflated his ego. Guy let him leave at 8, so he'd have plenty of time to meet with his team. Naruto reached into his pocket and hefted his frog-shaped wallet. He'd even have time for a quick breakfast, and there was still plenty of money left from running all those D-rank missions. Kurenai-sensei had been right about how the money would accumulate if they kept doing those twice a day. He was nearing his destination, his mind weighing the pros and cons of having miso soup versus grilled sardines with his rice, when he saw a familiar figure. "Ohio, Hinata-san," he called out, breaking into a trot. But the words of his greeting seemed to stick in his throat as he realized something was wrong. Hyuga Hinata, though she wasn't very dynamic in her body language, always moved with a certain grace and precision. Naruto was impressed by the way that carried over to her taijutsu, as she seemed to float when they sparred, evading his attacks with an effortless ease that he both admired and envied. Of course, the last time he tried to explain that to his teammate when he complimented her, she looked down and promised to put more effort into her sparring. Naruto didn't know if it was her ears or his mouth, but somehow every time he tried to say something nice to her, it always came out negatively. But none of that grace and ease was evident today. His teammate stumbled along the sidewalk in a daze. Her jacket was creased like she'd slept in it, and her backpack hung off one shoulder with the ties half undone. At the sound of Naruto's voice, she flinched and the strap slipped off her shoulder. She caught it before it slid down too far, but the top of her bag opened, spilling out a haphazard tangle of clothes, weapons, and supplies on the sidewalk. Without even looking back, Hinata slumped to the ground, kneeling on the hard pavement as she mechanically began stuffing things back into her bag. Naruto rushed over, wondering what was wrong with his teammate. Hinata's face was lowered, and he could barely see her nose as her lank hair hung forward across her forehead. "Hinata?" he asked cautiously. She shook her head, but did not answer. Naruto knelt down and handed her a kunai that had skidded out of her reach. He noticed that her hands were shaking as she grasped the handle with murmured thanks. Uzumaki Naruto would never be mistaken for a genius of perceptive talent, but even he could tell that something was wrong, drastically wrong with his teammate. He remembered old man Ichiraku's words. It was true that Hinata and Shino were becoming friends as well as teammates. But now, that once happy thought filled him with dread. Had she somehow found out about his prisoner? No, her manner seemed more painful and despairing than fearful. She hadn't been afraid to accept the kunai from his hand, either. Naruto frowned as his thoughts chased each other around, with no clear resolution in sight. Something was wrong with his friend, and he needed to do something. Naruto knelt down a little lower, trying to make contact with Hinata's palest lavender eyes. "Hinata-chan?" he asked nervously, and immediately swallowed. Hinata's head jerked up like she'd been struck, and Naruto saw that she indeed had been. There was a large angry bruise on her left cheek, and another along the right side of her jaw. There were smudges of dirt here and there and dried blood near one nostril and at the corner of her mouth. The skin around Hinata's eyes was dark from fatigue, and at this range he could see tiny red blood vessels along the edges of the eyes themselves. Naruto felt his mouth drop open and Hinata immediately ducked her head back down. At least she hadn't hit him for using the familiar form of address, like Sakura used to, not that he wouldn't prefer that reaction to this, when he thought about it. Naruto helped her gather the last of her possessions, gradually becoming aware of the increasing foot traffic around them. The merchants and shopkeepers were getting ready to start another day in Konoha, as he racked his brain for something to say. "What happened to your face?" Or, "Why do you look like you got beat up?" did not seem appropriate, not when he thought about that anguished look. Hinata stuffed everything back into her bag, and painstakingly redid the ties, even though her fingers still shook a little. Naruto fidgeted uncomfortably while she did this, looked around, and stuck his hands into his pockets. Touching his frog purse reminded him of his earlier debate. "Nay, Hinata, have you had breakfast yet?" he asked cautiously. She shook her head, but did not speak. "Come on then," he said, in what he hoped was an encouraging tone of voice. "Ichiraku's is on the way to the Hokage's tower, and we still have plenty of time." Hinata's shoulders slumped, but she began trudging forward. Seeing her like this made Naruto feel anxious, almost sick in a way. Not the expired milk, kind of sick, but unsettled. Tell you what, he said suddenly, trying to sound cheerful, since I made you spill out your bag, I'll buy you breakfast. Naruto, you don't have to do that, she said, her voice little more than a tired whisper. There was a dead, defeated undertone to her words that Naruto had never heard from his teammate before. He didn't know why, but he found that even more alarming. After all those times you fed me dinner. He scoffed, trying to maintain a jocular tone, I think I owe you more than a few breakfasts. Seeing no reaction to his words, he leaned toward her and dropped his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He didn't want anyone to overhear his next words. Actually, it's not fair even then. Overall, I think you cook better than old man Ichiraku does, but don't tell him I said that. He hissed dramatically. Hinata stumbled a little when he said that, and Naruto automatically reached out to steady her elbow. His fingers barely brushed her upper arm, but she flinched away like he'd struck her. He saw her lips press together as she tried to bite back a hiss of pain. Hinata, are you okay? He asked before he could stop himself. She nodded, and then spoke when her breathing returned to normal. I had training last night, she said. It was very strenuous. Anyo, Naruto said, didn't Kurenai-sensei say to take it easy and get to bed early last night? Hinata nodded. This was a special family training session. Father had something he wanted me to learn before I left. Really? Naruto asked eagerly. Is it a new technique, or a special jutsu? Can you show me next time we practice? He figured anything that tough to learn had to be pretty spectacular. But Hinata just ducked her head down until she was almost completely facing the ground. Naruto really had no idea what to say that couldn't make things worse, so he was silent until they reached Ichiraku's. The old man was polishing the countertop with a folded cloth as a fat merchant in a silk robe got up and left, leaving some coins next to his empty plate. Hey, Naruto, one more for the road until you're off on your mission? He asked. But his smile faded a little when he saw Naruto's companion. They both settled on stools, though Hinata was still moving stiffly. Naruto glanced at his teammate out of the corner of his eye. Do you know what you want? He asked, gesturing at the menu. When Hinata didn't answer, Naruto frowned, scratching at the back of his head. Where was Kurenai-sensei when he needed someone smart to unravel the mysteries of Kunoichi? Would you like to just get what I'm having then? He asked cautiously. Hinata nodded wearily, seeming to droop on the stool. Okay. I'd like miso soup, rice balls, and pickles for both of us, he said, digging out his wallet and checking its contents. And some of those dumplings with the bean paste for my friend, he added. He knew from the dinners that was one of her favorite treats. Arigato, Naruto-san, Hinata said in an uneven voice. Good morning, Naruto, Ayame said as she emerged from the back room with a broom. She frowned a little when she saw Hinata, but Naruto had no idea why. She then looked over at her father for a moment. Hello, Hinata-san, she said after a moment. We're planning to get some new tiles laid in back, and I was hoping I could get your opinion on the patterns. Father has his heart set on this one design, but I think it would clash horribly. I'd like to get another woman's opinion on this, since we all know men are hopeless at such things. The old man, of course, took loud exception to this, and father and daughter began a spate of good-natured bickering that sounded like a well-rehearsed skit to Naruto's ears. Somehow, halfway through it, Ayame was on the other side of the counter, gently taking Hinata by the shoulder, and leading the weakly protesting girl away. I'll watch your bag, Naruto volunteered, helping her ease the strap off her shoulder. Minus the weight, Hinata seemed to straighten up a bit more. Naruto knew she must have been very tired for it to have affected her so much. Her arm and leg weights had been added to several times after Kurenai had procured a set of braces that would fit the slim girl's wrists and ankles. Naruto fidgeted as the old man prepared their food. It wasn't that he didn't believe Hinata so much as that he suspected she wasn't telling him everything. He needed to see, underneath the underneath, but he didn't have any idea what he should be looking for in this situation. He frowned as he tried to think, but nothing seemed to make sense to him. What happened to your friend? The old man asked in a low voice as he began to lay out the porcelain squares with their food. I wish I knew, Naruto said in a miserable voice. He was getting really sick of being confused and always doing the wrong thing. Well, I think Ayame is helping her get cleaned up a bit. One thing I have learned being married and raising a daughter, a woman having a rough day will feel twice as bad if she looks rough as well, the old man confided. Arigato, Naruto said gratefully. Ayame was a girl, so maybe Hinata's problem, whatever it was, would make sense to her. Think nothing of it, the old man said in grand voice. A good chef knows to take care of his regular customers. Besides, he added, you kids are good people. If I could make a living just cooking for shinobi, I'd ban those cheap, whiny, self-satisfied merchants from here in a minute. Just don't tell them I said that, at least until I retire. The old man's rant brought a smile to Naruto's lips, and he began to relax a little and had a sip of his tea. A few minutes later, Ayame's voice came echoing from the back of the ramen stand. I think you are right about the patterns, Hinata-san. If we use that design, but reverse the colors, it won't look so bad, and it won't overpower everything else. When she led the girl back around to the front, even Naruto could see the changes. Hinata's hair was a little damp, and had been recently brushed. Her face was clean, and the bruises seemed much fainter than they had earlier. While she still had dark circles around them, her eyes didn't seem to be as red, either. When she sat down, she still wouldn't meet Naruto's eyes, but she didn't seem as beaten down as before. Her eyes darted toward Naruto's chopsticks, poised above his untouched food, and she ducked her head in apology. Gomen, Naruto, I did not mean to make you wait to eat. Naruto snorted. Kurenai-sensei has been trying to teach me manners. It's hard enough to remember the complicated things, so I might as well do the simple ones right, He smiled at his teammate, but she did not look up. Well, now that you're here. Itadakimasu. With that, they started breakfast. Naruto noticed that Hinata, for once, was eating almost as quickly as he was. He wondered if that special training had made her miss supper, as well as breakfast. He also wondered if he should ask Kurenai-sensei about this special family training, especially if they were going to make Hinata do it right before a potentially dangerous mission. The formerly dormant part of his brain that he'd discovered during their team's first mission planning exercise decided that Hinata was probably at less than 50% of her normal effectiveness. If they ran into problems, he'd have to make sure he was backing her up immediately. As tired and sore as she was, he doubted she'd be able to defend herself for long in a real fight. Fortunately, the food seemed to restore her a bit as well, and she was able to shoulder her bag without straining as they prepared to leave. Naruto left the money on the counter, along with a large tip for Ayame. The old man's eyes darted toward Hinata as she adjusted the straps on her bag. You two come back safe, he said gruffly. We will, Naruto assured him. Ooh. Kurenai was pleased to see her genins already waiting for her as she approached the Hokage's tower for their assignment. The horror stories she'd heard from Asuma and the others about irresponsible students seemed to be just that, stories. She smirked. Or maybe they took after their jonins, at least in Asuma's case. Team 10 had done less than a third as many missions as Team 8, and Kurenai had yet to see them do any really serious training. Asuma Baka was relying far too much on the Akimichi Yamanaka Nara synergy and not enough on hard work and preparation. Kurenai's musing cut off as she approached the bench. Shino was standing next to it, staring at her. Naruto was sitting, as was Hinata. Or more accurately, Naruto was sitting there, petrified. Hinata was asleep, her head resting on her teammate's shoulder. While one part of her found the scene to be rather cute, and wished she'd had a camera to record the moment, for the most part she was concerned. This was not normal behavior for the kunoichi, who always took care to ensure she was prepared for the day's activities. Had she and Naruto ignored her orders about getting a full night's sleep and decided to train anyway? Was she sick? If the latter was true, they'd have to delay their mission or leave her in Konoha. Either outcome would not be good for the girl. For that matter, Naruto looked unusually nervous as well. Did he know something? Or was he partially to blame for her condition? Kurenai pondered things she'd been hoping to put off for a while when she noticed a far simpler and more likely cause. Of the people walking past the bench, shinobi and villagers alike, a fair proportion were giving the boy a dirty look, like he'd done something wrong. That probably accounted for his guilty expression, or at least she hoped it did. Kurenai came to stand before her students. It took no more than a raised eyebrow to get Naruto talking in a strained whisper. She noted that, despite his agitation, he took great pains not to move his shoulder a millimeter as he talked. I ran into Hinata after I left Gai-sensei and Lee. She was really tired and could barely walk. When I said hello, she dropped her bag and I had to help pick her stuff up. She'd said she had to do some special training with her family. I think they kept her up all night. We had some time, so I bought her breakfast at Ichiraku's. From the way she ate, I don't think she'd had anything to eat since lunch yesterday. When we got here, we were still a little early, so we sat down to wait, and next thing I know she's asleep on my shoulder, and honest, I didn't do anything. The blonde genin whispered, without pausing for breath. Kurenai held up her palm to forestall any further explanations. Naruto might pass out from oxygen deprivation if he continued. You did the right thing, Naruto, she reassured him. This, family training, is quite troubling, Shino said. Kurenai wondered if he really meant troublesome, instead, since it could interfere with their mission. But then she looked at the expressionless boy and remembered how seldom he misspoke himself. It was good to see he wasn't as cold and uncaring on the inside as he appeared on the outside. I agree, she replied, nodding. I hope she isn't coming down with something, she said as she carefully rested the back of her hand against the girl's forehead. The skin was cool at first, but at the slight touch Hinata's eyes popped open and she made a small, indistinct noise as she stiffened. A moment later her forehead threatened to scorch the back of Kurenai's hand as her face was enveloped in a rosy blush. Gee Gomen, the girl squeaked as she almost leapt away from Naruto and stood at attention. Kurenai smiled down at the girl, even as she seethed inside. Special family training, was it? Hiyashi should have been proud of what his daughter had accomplished yesterday. Was he so personally invested in her being a failure that he'd punish her for attempting to grow beyond it? Even with all she knew of the man, it seemed impossible. Well, monstrous people did monstrous things, and she already knew of one, even if she lacked the proof. But Hinata was not her father. Revenge against one did not justify injustice toward the other. Perhaps, even, the opposite was true, and one would require the other. That would remain to be seen, as it depended on another's strength, and right now she appeared to be a very slender reed indeed. Nonetheless, Kurenai smiled down at her subordinate. Hinata, I am glad you still made it here, even if you are not feeling well. Your determination not to miss this mission briefing is noted and appreciated. I see that it is 5 minutes before the hour, are you ready to proceed? Hinata nodded, ducking her head. Naruto just looked confused, and Kurenai hoped he didn't interpret Hinata leaping away from him as a rejection. She squeezed the bridge of her nose as Hinata and Naruto moved toward their appointment. When she looked up, she saw Shino, and had the oddest impression that he was smiling at her behind his high collar. Ooh, Hinata looked down and concentrated on placing her feet correctly. She would not stumble and humiliate herself further. Fortunately, the meal and the brief rest had temporarily restored some of her energy, and she moved with much greater ease. Thinking about that brief rest brought heat rushing back to her cheeks. She didn't know what had possessed her to do that. They'd arrived at the tower with 15 minutes to spare, so Naruto suggested they sit on one of the benches. The morning sunlight was warm, and combined with her fatigue and the fine breakfast she'd just eaten, she hadn't stood a prayer of staying awake. But why did she have to wake up leaning on Naruto? Of course, if she'd leaned the other way she might have toppled over, or even fallen off the bench, but that might have been preferable. At least he hadn't complained or shoved her off of him. Naruto was too nice to do that anyway. For that matter, why was everyone being so nice to her? First Naruto, stopping to help her with her things, and even calling her Hinata-chan, at one point, though she thought her ears were probably deceiving her, telling her what she wanted to hear. Instead of losing patience with her bumbling, he'd even offered to buy her breakfast. That was almost like a date, in a way, since he even paid for her food. It wasn't really like that. He'd just offered to pay her back for the dinners she'd shared with him, but if it had been Uchiha Sasuke who'd bought her breakfast, Hinata knew that most of the village girls her age would have been wishing for her violent death. So even if it wasn't a real date, it had to count for something, didn't it? And then Ayame Oni-san, on the pretext of asking her a. Naruto kept an eye on Hinata as they ascended the Hokage's tower. She seemed a lot steadier than before, which was good, but he didn't want to take any chances either. He also studiously avoided making any sort of eye contact with Shino. He was pretty sure the damn bug user had been silently laughing at him since he'd arrived at the base of the tower that morning. He'd looked down at Naruto and the sleeping Hinata without saying a single word. Finally Naruto had whispered, "She's really tired," as quietly as he could. "I can see," Shino replied, deadpan. Unfortunately, with that high collar, Naruto couldn't see the boy's mouth to be sure. Nonetheless, he silently promised himself to kick the larger boy's butt the next time they sparred. And to top off the day's weirdness, his shoulder still felt warm where her head had rested on it. At least the Chunin guarding the Hokage's office had retained their attitude adjustment from the previous day, though Naruto wondered if that would necessarily have been true if Kurenai-sensei hadn't been bringing up the rear. At least he knew the Hokage's smile wasn't feigned when they entered his office. He murmured as they stood at attention before his desk. He held out a pair of scrolls for Kurenai. The scroll with the blue seal contains the details of your assignment. You will be patrolling that section of the border with Earth Country for 3 weeks, starting 3 days from now. That should allow you plenty of time to travel and familiarize yourself with the area. The scroll with the red seal is to be presented to the leader of the team currently in place, a Jonin named Darikatsu. We're relieving Darikatsu's team, Kurenai asked, her voice holding a little edge. Yes, the Hokage answered, gesturing at the Jonin with his pipe. Do you know him? Kurenai nodded. In passing. I am surprised he was put in charge of such a sensitive location. The old man grunted, and a rueful expression passed over his face, disappearing so quickly Naruto wondered if he'd imagined it. There have been a few incidents lately. Skirmishes that seem to straddle the line between our two countries. It's never really clear which side of the border it started on, so there have been messy diplomatic repercussions. There are a lot of people over there that are still angry about a war fought before your genins were born. To give our envoy to Earth something to use, he can now inform them that Darikatsu's team of combat veterans has been replaced with a genin team, and request that they reciprocate. I'm explaining this because I want all of you to adopt a very flexible approach to border intrusions. You want us to just let anyone through? Naruto asked in disbelief. No, the Hokage said firmly as he shook his head. But I do want you to make sure that if you intercept someone, it happens in a location that makes it very clear who violated whose border. Naruto frowned as he puzzled out his leader's words. So you want us to make sure the other side gets the blame if there's a fight? The Hokage nodded. Yes, although I hope there won't be any confrontations, especially if Earth stands down their patrol as well. Kurenai spoke up again. We will make sure we always patrol a few kilometers back from the actual border, so any confrontations will occur on fire territory. The Hokage nodded. Very well. Good luck and I will see you in about 3.5 weeks. Your relief will have a scroll with a red seal like that one. Do not accept messages from anyone who does not have such a scroll. Understood. They all nodded, and with that they left the Hokage's office. Starting his first C-rank mission, Naruto wanted to jump into the air and shout, "Yada!" But two things stopped him. The first was Kurenai's lectures to her team about proper decorum. Hinata already seemed familiar with all the rules, and while Shino appeared mildly interested, Naruto figured they were aimed primarily at him. The other was Hinata's condition, the reasons for which he did not fully understand. Team 8 moved through the streets of Konoha at a quick walk, heading for the nearest gate. Stepping through the portal wasn't anything they hadn't already done dozens of times, but somehow it felt different. He nervously adjusted the kunai holster on his right leg, and resisted the urge to pull one out and twirl it by the ring at the end of the handle. They were on the trade road that led to Earth Country for over 2 hours before Kurenai called for a break. Naruto was still full of energy, but he noticed Hinata was faltering. Her apparent lack of rest the previous night was catching up with her. She slipped her bag off her shoulders, sat down at the base of a tree, and leaned back, closing her eyes. Naruto frowned and sat down next to his teammate. "You may want to take your arm and leg weights off, if you're still wearing them," he said quietly. Hinata started at the sound of his voice, eyes popping open again. After a moment she self-consciously grasped her forearm through the sleeve of her jacket. Anyo, that is all right, Naruto." Naruto frowned. "But if you are tired, it might help," he said reasonably. Hinata smiled. "But then I will just have more weight to carry in my bag." Naruto shrugged. "We can stick them in my pack. I didn't stay up all night, and I missed having you Jiyuken the crap out of me last night." Hinata smiled wearily, and Naruto thought he heard a small snort of laughter. Her hand tightened around her sleeve again. "Seriously, Naruto, I will be all right. I won't improve if I don't keep the weights on, will I?" "Well," Naruto said slowly, "it depends. Guy-sensei said that if you overuse the muscles in your arms and legs, you sometimes have to leave the weights off until you recover." Of course, the stabbing pains and muscle tears the man described to Naruto never seemed to last longer than a few minutes. But then again, he probably hadn't ever really hurt himself that way. Hinata looked thoughtful. "I am a bit sore, but not in that way. I should probably keep them on," she said firmly. Then she looked down at the ground between her legs. "I appreciate your concern," she added politely. Naruto found himself scratching at the back of his head again. Yeah, well, you're my teammate after all," he said. For some reason her shoulders slumped after he said that. "And you're really fun to spar with," he added. Hinata nodded without looking up and Naruto decided to go see Kurenai-sensei before he said something stupid again. Kurenai did not want to make Hinata any more self-conscious than necessary, so she was subtle in her attempts to keep an eye on the girl. She took note of the Hyuga's condition using her peripheral vision, and always when something else seemed to draw her attention. Naruto and Shino's concern for their teammate was more obvious, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Kurenai hoped that the boy's concern would make an impression on the girl. Naruto was as obvious as he was sincere, a felicitous combination in this situation. After a couple of hours on the trade road, Kurenai called for a quick break. Hinata's fatigue was becoming more and more apparent with every step, and it didn't surprise her that Hinata, after a brief conversation with Naruto, had fallen asleep leaning against a tree. Naruto walked toward Kurenai as she fished her canteen out of her pack and took a small swallow. He had an uncharacteristically grim look on his face, displacing his normal smile. "She's exhausted," he said quietly. "I don't think her father should have insisted on her training all night." Kurenai bit back the first couple of things she wanted to say, and settled for just nodding her agreement. The blonde genin opened his mouth like he had more to say, but after a moment he just closed it, shaking his head as he walked off toward Shino. He deliberately scuffed his feet on the ground, kicking any loose pebbles or twigs in his path, and Kurenai didn't need any special jutsu to read his frustration. 10 minutes later, after they'd all had a drink and refreshed themselves, they were ready to resume their journey, but the girl was still sound asleep. Kurenai was contemplating how best to wake her charge when Naruto and Shino walked up to their teammate in a fairly matter-of-fact manner. Naruto picked up Hinata's bag and handed it to Shino, who in turn locked the straps with his own pack. Naruto turned back to his teammate and visibly swallowed. Then he quickly bent over and wrapped one arm around Hinata's legs, loosely grasping her shoulder with his other hand. He carefully straightened up and Hinata was neatly folded over his shoulder, still sleeping. Kurenai recognized the academy-taught method for carrying a wounded comrade who was stable enough to travel, but unable to walk on their own. What amazed the Jonin was the fact that the girl slept through the entire process. That could only indicate acute fatigue, combined with almost total chakra depletion. It was surprising she made it as far as she did, Kurenai decided. Naruto turned toward his sensei and slowly nodded. "I'm ready," he said quietly. Kurenai frowned. Naruto was holding himself a little stiffly, and she remembered that he was wearing weights on his arms and legs as well. "Are you sure about this, Naruto?" The boy nodded carefully. "It'll be good training, I think." Kurenai wondered if he'd been spending too much time with Guy and Lee. Ooh. Hinata awoke feeling painfully stiff. She blinked up at the ceiling wondering how she'd arrived. The last thing she remembered was taking a short break on the side of the road, but now she appeared to be in a room of some sort. Attempting to sit up was a mistake, she immediately realized, as her abused muscles punished her mercilessly. Her body felt stiff as a board, but far more tender. She stifled a low moan. "Ah, you are awake," a voice said in the darkened room. Hinata's fingers slowly formed the seals under the coverlet as she whispered, "Byakugan." She released her blood limit as soon as she sensed Kurenai-sensei was the only other person in the room. "None of that," Kurenai said sharply, making Hinata twitch painfully. "Your reserves are still very low," she continued in a kindlier tone. "Kindly restrict your chakra usage until you have fully recovered." Gomen, Hinata stammered, her face flushing. "Now, regarding this special family training of yours," Kurenai began, letting her voice trail off. "Is there anything you'd like to tell me?" she finally asked. "No, sensei," Hinata replied quietly. "Hinata, I put you to bed," her teacher said in a chiding tone. "I saw. You were covered with bruises and abrasions. Your chakra was so low, I was amazed you could even move, let alone walk for 2 hours. What kind of training leaves you incapacitated?" Hinata opened her mouth to answer, but then closed it. "I am not permitted to discuss certain things with people outside my family," she finally said. Kurenai sighed. "Be that as it may, you are still a ninja on active duty with the Leaf. As such, you are required to keep yourself in good health, and that does not include letting yourself become disabled when you know you have a mission the next day." "Gomen, sensei, I told," Hinata began, but then swallowed her next words. It was shameful to spout excuses for her failures and shortcomings. "You told your father, didn't you?" Kurenai asked in a shrewd tone. "Remember, Hinata, I was there when you left for the academy. Your father makes no secret of his contempt for the other shinobi of the village." Hinata's only response was a choked sound. "Do not apologize for matters over which you have no control, Hinata," Kurenai continued in a kindlier voice. Then her voice changed, becoming more formal in tone. "But I will require you to refuse any training or exercises that could compromise your ability to participate in our missions. As your Jonin, I have the authority to do that. Your responsibility is to convey that directive to your father if the situation ever arises again." Hinata inhaled sharply at the thought of how such a conversation would go. As if reading her thoughts, Kurenai sighed. "I know that will not be easy for you, but if something like this happens again, either you or your father will have to answer for it. If, after explaining my orders, you are still forced, then it will not be your fault. Do you understand?" Hinata nodded slowly, ignoring the ache. But the thought of refusing her father filled her with dread. "Good. And Hinata, if you ever need to, well, my door is open if you need to talk after we return to Konoha." This inn will be serving dinner soon if you are hungry. Your uniform is next to you on the floor. I'm going to go look in on Naruto and Shino. The door slid aside, and then back, and Hinata knew she was alone. Ooh. Shino was limping slightly as he followed his teammate back to the inn. They were only a day's travel from the border with Earth, so their Jonin decided to spend the extra day at a roadside inn that typically served merchants traveling between Fire Country and Earth Country. Of course, sitting still for a day did not appeal to Naruto. Immediately after breakfast he began urging them to train. Kurenai wanted to keep an eye on the still sleeping Hinata, so Shino followed Naruto out into the woods to spar. Naruto had evidently needed to work out some of his agitation and frustration regarding their teammate, because Shino couldn't recall ever getting the excrement kicked out of him this badly since he'd started at the Konoha Ninja Academy. Fortunately, the blonde genin remembered to pull his punches, so Shino only had some mild contusions to add to his puzzled embarrassment. The boy's speed had increased to a remarkable degree, and the power behind his blocks and counters threatened to knock the larger boy out of his stances every time they clashed. This isn't to say that the bug user hadn't gotten in a few shots of his own, one of which he'd inadvertently landed at full force when Naruto tried to duck under it and go for a sweep. The result was a small mouse under the blonde's left eye, and a throbbing wrist that bothered Shino more and more as the adrenaline wore off. The blow barely fazed his opponent, who merely came to his feet after a backwards roll and nodded acknowledgement of the point. The changes wrought in Naruto's fighting style by his supplemental training were all too apparent to Shino. Gone were the awkward, exaggerated versions of the basic taijutsu stances. Naruto's footing was now sure and his movements exceptionally fluid. His attacks and counters were less straightforward and more circular in motion. Naruto still favored attacking from unusual directions, but his dependence on the terrain had lessened. He didn't hesitate to launch himself into the air for a flying kick, confident that his speed would allow him to complete the move without being caught in the air. Indeed, the one time Shino managed to catch one of Naruto's high kicks, the genin simply twisted in midair and used a scissoring motion to bring his other heel crashing into the side of the Kikai nin's head. The worst part was that Naruto had done all this with nearly half of Shino's colony attached to his back, steadily draining chakra until they let go, replete. That was something he'd rarely seen an individual Kikai bug do, let alone dozens of them at once. The amount of chakra they'd drained from the boy was amazing. The worst part of all was that Naruto didn't even seem to have noticed. Shino frowned at Naruto's back as he followed the boy back to the inn. Chakra reserves that large were rare in a Jonin, let alone a genin. Could it be linked to the mystery surrounding Naruto that his father was forbidden to discuss? His mind worked furiously as Naruto, still energized from the sparring, babbled happily about a dozen topics at once. The only thing that came to mind was his father's words about relying on first-hand observations. Listening to his teammate wonder if Hinata was awake yet and if he could talk the cook into serving ramen, Shino decided to do just that. For now. Ooh. Naruto bounced in his seat as he waited for their food to arrive. Sparring with Shino had really woken up his appetite, especially since he'd actually held his own against his taller teammate. He was also happy to discover that the inn's proprietors, a middle-aged couple who apparently rarely visited Konoha, didn't seem to be aware of his prisoner and treated him so nicely it was a little disconcerting. The wife, who ran the kitchen, kept patting him on the head and saying how he reminded her of her son. She was quite a good cook, and boasted experience in many regional cuisines, so she seemed a little disconcerted when her favorite guest asked for ramen. Normally, she said, such a dish was a bit beneath her talents, but she couldn't seem to say no when Naruto smiled and bowed apologetically with his palms together. Naruto was working on his second bowl, trying to puzzle out the unusual spices the nice old lady had mixed into the broth, when a voice coming from behind him almost made him fall to the floor. Ramen again? Kurenai asked in a disapproving tone. Yeah, Naruto said, ducking his head as he turned toward his sensei. I'm going without for 3 weeks as it is, he continued in a slightly petulant tone. Kurenai sighed. 3 weeks of trail rations and whatever we can gather on our own. All the more reason to eat nutritious food when you have the opportunity, Naruto. Not just bowl after bowl of noodles. I do not think there is any danger of Naruto becoming malnourished at this inn, Shino observed. Not after the breakfast he was served. Naruto turned back and glared across the table at his teammate. You're just mad because Obasan almost swatted one of your bugs when she saw it on your shoulder. The reckless slaughter of innocent and productive creatures is not something to take lightly, Shino insisted in a frosty tone. She might have been more careful in her judgment if she had not been distracted attempting to sat your appetite. Naruto stuck his lower lip out and scowled at his teammate. I didn't ask her to do that. It's just, every time she came out of the kitchen and she saw my plate was empty, she put more food on it. He shrugged. Maybe she had a lot of food that was about to go bad or something. Shino didn't respond to that, but Naruto did hear the muted buzzing that sometimes occurred when his teammate was displeased about something. Naruto figured it was his bugs reacting, but he really didn't want to think too much about that. Kurenai sat down next to Shino, and soon the cook was taking her dinner order as well. With a warm smile at Naruto, the older woman bustled back to her kitchen to prepare the Jonin's food. It had been a long time since Naruto had actively wondered what it would be like to have a mother. Normally, he was too busy for such thoughts, which was at least partially intentional. But now, waiting for Hinata to recover so they could resume their journey, Naruto had an unusually large amount of time on his hands. He found himself thinking more and more about the innkeeper's reactions. What would it be like to live in a village where everyone treated him like that? Konoha was his home, but what would it be like to not have people glaring at him all the time, praying for his death, or telling their children to stay away from that Uzumaki brat? Those thoughts made him very uncomfortable, and he tried to suppress them without much success. Then he followed Kurenai's advice from several weeks ago, and tried to logically examine his options. If he tried to move to another village, his new neighbors would want to know why. If they ever found out he had a demon bound within his stomach, Naruto knew his welcome would expire soon afterwards. Even if he came up with a believable story, he'd still need to be able to make a living. He knew a little about being a ninja, but not much else. He couldn't join another hidden village as a shinobi for several reasons. 1. He'd be hunted down as a missing nin by the Konoha Anbu squads. 2. His new employers would probably be able to detect that stupid damn fox and he'd be back at square one with everyone fearing and hating him. 3. Eventually he'd be sent on a mission where he'd have to fight one of his former classmates. While he wouldn't mind kicking Sasuke's butt, having to fight Shino, Lee, or Hinata for real was not something he could even consider without going into a cold sweat. No, he was stuck with Konoha in much the same way Konoha was stuck with him. A small, perverse corner of his mind was pleased by that. It would make becoming the Hokage even sweeter. With a smile, he readdressed himself to the oddly seasoned ramen. But after a couple of bites, he noticed that everyone else was staring at something immediately to his left. He quickly swallowed and turned his head as well. Hinata, a little pale and unsteady, was easing herself onto the bench next to him. Naruto almost reached out to steady her, but something made him hesitate. Remembering her insistence that she could carry her own bag and wear her weights despite her exhaustion, he realized that trying to help her might make her feel even more self-conscious. So he refrained, and wondered if he was actually getting smarter about such things. Or was his sudden intuition merely dumb luck? Gomen, Hinata said quietly. You were right, Naruto, she continued in a subdued voice, about the weights, and everything. Naruto just shrugged at his teammate, wondering if something else was wrong. I'm just glad you're feeling better, he said. I missed you. Naruto coughed suddenly as Hinata's eyes widened. I mean, I missed sparring with you. Last night. You know. Like we always do, he added quickly. Hinata just nodded her agreement, looking downward the entire time. Ooh. The next day, They were back on the road again, bright and early. Naruto was still a little groggy and yawned frequently for the first hour. The pallets they'd slept on were far softer than he was used to, so he had trouble sleeping at night. Surprisingly, the innkeeper's wife got up early as well, to send them on their way with a good breakfast. Catching Kurenai's look, Naruto made sure to thank her and let her know how much he appreciated her efforts. The way the older lady just beamed at him made him feel very strange, and he found himself blushing as they left. After they left the inn, Kurenai-sensei walked beside him for a while, and thanked him for not taking advantage of the cook's friendliness. Naruto frowned at his sensei. "Why would I do that?" he asked. Kurenai smiled thinly. "Why indeed? She doesn't act like most of the other villagers you've known. I talked to her briefly the day before. Her son, a boy you bear a passing resemblance to, went to Konoha several years ago to attend the ninja academy." "Really?" Naruto asked. "What rank is he now? Have we met him?" "He died during his Chunin exam," Kurenai answered in a somber tone. Naruto tripped over his own feet. "Oh," he said as he stumbled for a moment. "I will admit," Kurenai continued, "that I was slightly concerned that you might, inadvertently, take advantage of the situation. But aside from asking her to make ramen for you," she continued, making him duck his head a little, "your behavior was entirely appropriate." "I didn't think it was that big a deal," Naruto grumbled. "She did ask me what my favorite food was." Kurenai nodded at that. "As I said, I am glad you did not take advantage of the situation." Naruto scratched the back of his head. "Anyo, sensei, if I do that when people are nice to me, won't that encourage them to treat me like everyone else does?" Kurenai nodded. "Very good, Naruto. You are thinking ahead and considering the consequences of your actions." Naruto found his face reddening again. Kurenai nodded at him, and then turned to speak with Shino. Naruto took that as his cue to speed up a little, so he was walking beside Hinata. A good dinner, during which the nice old lady tried to stuff the weary kunoichi with as much food as she could hold, and another full night's sleep had restored most of Hinata's energy. She was still moving a little slower than normal, but she was out on point this morning, periodically activating her blood limit to do quick scans of the area around them. They walked together in a silence that was actually fairly comfortable. Naruto wondered if concentrating on the woods around them, scanning for an ambush, kept his teammate too busy to get nervous. They hadn't discussed exactly how Hinata had been transported to the inn, and he wasn't about to bring up that subject anytime soon. Naruto wasn't completely sure why he'd been the one to carry the girl. Of course, if there was danger, it would be better if their Jonin was unburdened. But he couldn't say for sure if that had even occurred to him at the time. What he did know was that her arm and leg weights were contributing to her fatigue, and she wouldn't even have been wearing them if he hadn't shown his off. He realized that seeing her exhausted and full of pain made him feel worse than he would if it had been himself. He wondered if this was what it was like to have friends, this feeling that you'd rather be hurt yourself than see them in pain. In a sudden flash of insight, Naruto understood why they'd been taught that shinobi should avoid friendships and close personal relationships with their comrades. The thought of his friend being hurt, or even killed, made him feel physically ill, like he'd drunk all the bad milk in Konoha in one sitting. But why had Kurenai-sensei urged him to become friends with his teammates? Then Naruto remembered his role in the team. He was supposed to cover their escape if they were ambushed or overrun. In that situation, he supposed it was useful if he cared a lot about his teammates. Naruto glanced back at his sensei. Had she pushed him to make friends so he would be more likely to sacrifice himself for them? That was a very uncomfortable thought, and it made Naruto feel very cold inside. He'd come to value Kurenai-sensei's wisdom and all the things she taught him. The idea that she was doing so just to manipulate him, but she hadn't really, had she? He needed to think this through, the way she'd taught him. Naruto recalled their first conversation at Moritake's. She'd already explained his role on Team 8, and asked him how hard he was willing to work to achieve his long-term goals. She hadn't really concealed anything from him, and her expectations were straightforward. If she really was just trying to get rid of the Kyuubi like the other villagers wanted, she wouldn't have set up extra training for him, now would she? Naruto admitted to himself that when he first became a genin, his taijutsu had been awful. Training with Guy Sensei and Lee, he was much more likely to survive any situation they got into. Naruto also remembered a conversation he'd had with the Hokage, many years ago, when the old man explained how the Hokage was the shinobi who protected everyone in the village, with his wisdom as well as his strength. That was the day that Naruto decided that he would become the Hokage someday. No one could ignore his existence then. Were his current duties all that much different? True, Kurenai-sensei was doing most of the thinking here, but wasn't it Naruto's job to help protect his teammates? Wasn't that just like what the Hokage did? Or at least a little bit like it? Maybe he was trying to see underneath the underneath, when there was no real underneath to see. Naruto tried to think his way through this question as the sun climbed steadily in the sky. Around noontime, Kurenai called a halt so they could eat some trail mix and drink from their canteens. Seeing as how there was no stream nearby, she also showed them a new jutsu for permanently summoning small amounts of water by collecting the humidity present in the ground and air around them. Naruto was eager to learn any new jutsus he could, and watched Kurenai slowly form the seals with eager eyes. Hinata and Shino both performed the simple jutsu without much trouble, while Naruto frantically practiced the seals. When it was his turn, Naruto was a little nervous, but managed to form the seals correctly as he said, "Sweeten. Condensation." However, instead of a 2-inch wide spinning vortex of air appearing over the mouth of his canteen, Naruto summoned one nearly a foot across. The torrent of water that gushed down out of it not only filled his canteen, but it also knocked it over and splattered their sandals and pant legs with mud. At the same time, the air became extremely parched, stinging his throat. Naruto managed to grab his canteen before all the water poured out, and then smiled sheepishly at his teammates as they tried to shake the spattered mud off their legs. Neither Shino nor Hinata said anything, but Kurenai finally broke the silence. "Should I assume that was an accident, Naruto? Or was that intentional?" she asked in a dry tone. "I wouldn't prank," Naruto said and cut himself off. He'd been about to say he wouldn't prank Hinata since she was just now feeling better, but she probably wouldn't appreciate hearing that. "Not during a mission, sensei," he said in a formal tone. "I see," Kurenai replied. "Well, I think it's safe to say that did not manifest as intended." "Do you know why?" Naruto shrugged, a little frustrated and embarrassed, but did not answer. "Anyo," Hinata said, breaking the silence. "Yes, Hinata," Kurenai asked. "Naruto, he always tries his best," the girl mumbled, looking down as a blush slowly crept up her cheeks. Naruto noticed her fingers clutching the hem of her jacket and he wondered why she was so tense. "He probably put too much chakra into the jutsu," she finally said, lifting her head a little. "It didn't go wrong, not really. He just gathered too much water for the canteen to hold." Naruto stared at his teammate, gratified that she wasn't rubbing it in. Really, she was just saying that he did it too well. He was still staring at her when she looked up, and her head shot back down so fast Naruto wondered if he'd just imagined it. "That was a very astute observation, Hinata," Kurenai said approvingly. "Naruto," the Jonin continued, "when using a jutsu, especially for the first time, it's a good idea to use just the minimum amount of chakra to complete it." Naruto frowned and scratched his head, forgetting for the moment that his hand was wet and a little muddy. "How do I know how much to use?" he asked, puzzled. Kurenai blinked. "As you complete the seals, you should feel a draining sensation as the jutsu attempts to draw the necessary chakra. Release just enough chakra for the draining sensation to stop, and no more." "Draining sensation?" Naruto asked quizzically. "What do you mean?" Kurenai paused for a long moment before answering. "When you use a jutsu, Don't you feel a slight draining sensation as your chakra goes to fuel the technique? Naruto shook his head, his eyes widening. What does it feel like? Kurenai asked carefully. More like relief, Naruto answered faintly, staring off into the distance. Then he blinked and nodded. It's like when you have to go to the bathroom really bad, and you couldn't for a while, and then when you do, it's really. Naruto's voice trailed off as he shook his head. Hinata was blushing again, and Shino's shoulders appeared to be quivering. Even the corners of Kurenai-sensei's mouth were turning up. It wasn't fair. You did ask me what it felt like, Naruto finally said in exasperation. You are correct, Naruto, his Jonin said with a nod. While your choice of metaphor is unfortunate, it is also descriptive. You appear to have larger than normal chakra reserves, which would also explain your ability to use Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. While a large reserve is desirable in a shinobi, most do not develop so large a capacity until after they have mastered basic chakra control techniques. You need to practice limiting how much chakra you allow to flow into your jutsus, starting with this one. Water any plants along the roadside that appear to be dried out, and see if you can reduce your effect size until it is comparable to Shino and Hinata's. Naruto nodded, grateful that something useful might come out of this debacle, besides managing to embarrass himself. In the future, Kurenai continued, when we learn new jutsus, I'll try to give you an expectation of how much chakra to use, in relation to this one. She smiled. We wouldn't want you to destroy your clothes with a cleansing jutsu, would we? Naruto laughed at that mental image, and wondered why Hinata squeaked and looked away. Following his sensei's directions, Naruto spent most of the afternoon eroding various spots along the trail. Hinata watched him closely each time he paused to practice over some particularly parched-looking bush. Oddly enough, though, it didn't make him self-conscious. He supposed he was used to her watching him when they practiced chakra control exercises. Since the water walking exercise, he hadn't had too many problems with the red chakra. According to Hinata, she could still occasionally see bits of it circulating through his coils where they ran close to the surface of his skin, but they didn't seem to be interfering as much anymore. Given what he knew about the probable source of the oddly colored chakra, Naruto wasn't sure what to make of that. If the stupid fox was aware of what was going on, it might have figured out that ruining Naruto's training just made it more likely they would both die on a mission. But this was a demon, after all, so he wasn't sure he could ascribe normal logic to its actions. Eventually, Naruto figured out how it should feel when he put just enough chakra into the jutsu. The first time he achieved this, Hinata gave him a broad smile, the first genuine one he'd seen from her since they left Konoha, and he promptly lost control of the jutsu and blasted the poor bush out by its roots. Hinata's face grew so chagrined that Naruto couldn't help but laugh out loud. Hinata looked down again, but eventually recovered and flashed a small grin of her own. You know, Naruto said, as they hustled along the road to get ahead of Kurenai and Shino again, it's nice to be out of Konoha, at least for a little while. Hi, Hinata agreed, nodding slowly. It's one of the nice things about being a shinobi, I guess, he continued. You get to travel a lot, going on missions. Naruto? Hinata asked quietly. Naruto turned toward the girl. Her face had gone very still, and she regarded him with widened eyes. Her mouth opened and closed once, with no sound coming out. Then she swallowed and was able to speak. Do you ever think about leaving Konoha? She asked quietly. As Hinata asked the question he'd asked himself the day before, Naruto felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. He'd hoped she hadn't noticed the villagers' hateful eyes, and the way they acted. Their attitude was a little more subdued around his teammates than when he was alone, and he tried to avoid the meaner adults as much as possible when he was with them. He thought he'd pulled it off since neither Shino nor Hinata had asked him about it. But Hinata's question, combined with the look on her face, told him that she knew all too well what was going on. For a moment, Naruto felt exposed, like he'd been caught coming out of the bath. The blonde shinobi didn't need to ask if his face gave away some of his emotions, because Hinata abruptly turned her head. He understood she was trying to avoid embarrassing him, but the reminder that he'd lost control of his facial expression was unwelcome. Ji Gomen, she said, studying a pine tree that appeared to have been struck by lightning at some point, that is none of my business. You're allowed to ask, Naruto said quickly. I don't know, really. Probably not, he reassured her. Konoha is my home. I can't become Hokage if I leave, can I? Besides, someone has to keep you three entertained with unfortunate metaphors, he added, grinning as she turned back. Hi, she said in a small voice, and seemed to relax a little. Naruto realized she was probably worried about having to break in a new teammate if he ran away from Konoha, which was understandable. Just their luck. They'd be stuck with an idiot like Sasuke who'd be too busy looking cool to actually watch their backs. By the time the sun was setting, Naruto felt like he had a pretty good feel for both the water-gathering jutsu and how to limit his chakra output. Kurenai led them away from the road for several minutes, until they found a small clearing in which they could pitch their tents. Hinata volunteered to gather stones for a small fire while the others ventured into the woods as Kurenai discussed how they would divide up the necessary tasks. With the assistance of Shino's bugs, the three of them found some rabbits for their evening meal. Kurenai showed them the proper way to clean the animals. By the time they'd brought the dressed meat back to their camp, Hinata had a bright but smokeless fire going inside the sunken fire pit she dug with the folding shovel from Kurenai's pack. It was deep enough that the flames would be invisible from more than a few yards away. Naruto was hopeful when he noticed that Hinata also had several handfuls of greenery that she'd collected. He hoped those were spices, because just eating burnt rabbit didn't appeal to him that much, but with the way Hinata prepared things, he might be looking forward to dinner after all. While Hinata tended the herb-stuffed rabbit sizzling on spits over the sunken fire, Naruto and Shino set up the tent they'd be sharing and Kurenai set up a tent for her and Hinata. By the time they were done, it was fully dark, and the appetizing smells were making Naruto's stomach rumble loudly. When they sat down to eat, Naruto was dismayed to see that there was a field ration bar set out for each of them. Kurenai seemed to note his expression, because she was looking directly at him when she spoke. Eat the rations first, then the rabbit. I'm sure Hinata has done an excellent job, if the smell is any indication, but each bar is designed to contain all the nutrients you should need for a day of high activity, she said. I don't want to see any pieces of them left over. We're going to be a long way from the nearest hospital, so we can't afford for anyone to get sick. Hi, Naruto said in a resigned tone. He picked up the bar, unwrapped it, and crammed it into his mouth with little ceremony. He chewed slowly and, with frequent sips from his canteen, eventually swallowed the pasty mess. Then he let out a sigh and picked up the skewer Hinata had stuck in the ground before him. It smelled even better at close range, especially after the offensively bland ration bar. He paused, noting that everyone else was reaching for their skewers, and nodded toward Hinata and said, "Itadakimasu." With a broad smile. The rabbit skewer lived up to his expectations, and he had to resist the urge to gobble it down. Instead, he ate it slowly, savoring the tasty meat. He glanced up at Hinata, who hadn't touched hers yet, and was instead looking nervously at her teammates. Naruto was amazed when he realized she was worried they wouldn't like it. Hinata, he said suddenly, making her jump. Hi, she squeaked, and Naruto nearly laughed out loud at the expression on her face. What did you use on this rabbit? He asked. Just some herbs I found, she answered hesitantly. Did it turn out bad? She asked, her face falling. No, it's really good, Naruto quickly assured her. I wasn't really looking forward to dinner until I smelled it cooking. Naruto is correct, Hinata, Shino added, making Naruto jump a little when the normally silent boy spoke. It is surprisingly flavorful. Hinata just blinked, and a slow flush crept up her cheeks. They are correct, Hinata, their sensei added. But then she frowned. But that does not mean you should always be stuck with the cooking. We should rotate tasks while we are on a mission. Naruto frowned at his teacher for a moment. Then his eyes widened and he turned toward Hinata. I'll do the wood gathering and water collection when it's your turn if you'll cook when it's my turn, he offered. Shino turned toward Naruto and nodded after a moment's silence. I will take your turn setting up the tents and hunting, he offered. Hinata's blush grew darker, but Kurenai's voice cut in. I expected better from both of you, she said in a frosty tone. Anyo, sensei, Hinata said quickly. It's all right. I like to cook. Kurenai didn't say anything else, but she gave both Naruto and Shino several dark looks as they consumed the skewers in silence. As they finished, Naruto gathered up the plates and utensils, and then bowed formally to the seething Jonin. Sensei, with your permission, I will demonstrate that I have mastered casting the water-gathering jutsu at an appropriate strength level. Kurenai eyed him for a moment, but then nodded. Naruto carried the plates off into the woods. As they stepped away from the camp, he said, I don't want to get any of our equipment wet if it misfires or runs down the hill. However, he led his teacher a lot further from the camp than was seemingly necessary. Finally, he stopped and set the plates down on top of an old log and turned back toward Kurenai. Before we do anything else, he began, I'd like to explain why I asked Hinata to trade tasks with me. There's a reason besides feeling like she should cook for you. Kurenai asked coolly, or is there something else? I cook for myself almost every day, Naruto said, scowling a little. But Hinata's really good at it, and I think it'll make her feel better. Kurenai looked a little puzzled. Explain, she said. It didn't really sound like a request, either. I'm not really sure why, he admitted, but it just seems to. Maybe because she's so good at it, and she likes to do something she knows she's good at. When we started training together in the evenings, she began bringing these really huge bentos and insisted on sharing her dinner with me. I figured out after a while that she always brought more than enough food for both of us. I never asked her to do it, but she seemed happy when I thanked her. He scratched his head. I'm not sure what happened with her training the night before we left Konoha, but I'm hoping letting her do the cooking will make her feel better. We just need to make sure she knows we like what she makes. Kurenai just looked at him for a long moment. I owe you and Shino an apology, it seems. Naruto just shrugged. But it is true that she'll do a better job than I will, he said, with a small grin. Kurenai smiled as well at his small confession. That was fairly perceptive of you, Naruto, she said approvingly. The boy just shrugged, though his cheeks reddened a little. Maybe, but I'm not perceptive enough to figure out what's going on. There's something wrong, isn't there? He asked. Kurenai took a deep breath. Perhaps, she allowed, but I am not permitted to say. Naruto frowned. I don't know what to do, he finally said. Kurenai thought about his obvious concern for his teammate, and wondered if Hinata had noticed it yet. I think it will come to you, she finally said. Now, you were going to demonstrate your mastery of a certain jutsu. Naruto shook his head suddenly. Hi, he said as he turned toward the plates and spread them out on the stump. Sweeten. Condensation. He barked as he finished the seals. A stream of water an inch and a half wide shot out of the chakra vortex that appeared in front of Naruto's palm. Though the stream did flow a bit quickly, it nonetheless rinsed off the plates and utensils without scattering them into the undergrowth. Much better, Kurenai said approvingly. Was it difficult to keep it under control? She asked. A little, Naruto admitted. Is it because of, you know? Kurenai sighed and nodded. I think so. But try to look at this positively. In the long run, I think it will be easier for you to learn to release chakra in smaller quantities than it would be for one of your classmates to build up a chakra capacity like yours. Naruto frowned. I suppose so, he said slowly. Now I need to figure out the appropriate amounts of chakra to release for every jutsu I know. I can help you there, Kurenai assured him. And if you are not overloading them every time you use them, you might find that they will misfire less often. Naruto looked thoughtful as he gathered up the plates. That's why I couldn't make a decent bunshin for my genin exam, wasn't it? But you can produce a horde of cage bunshin with greater reliability because it requires much more chakra, and therefore you aren't overloading the jutsu as badly. That would make sense, she concluded in a thoughtful voice. Sometimes I want to just jam a kunai through that stupid seal, Naruto growled, and see how that damn thing likes being messed with. I do not think that would be a good idea, Kurenai-sensei said in a very quiet voice. Naruto looked up and realized her face had become pale. I don't mean I want to cut my belly, Naruto said quickly. I'm just tired of this thing messing up my life. Then the best revenge is living well, isn't it? Kurenai asked. Naruto looked thoughtful again as he shook the water off the plates and stacked them up. I suppose it would be, he agreed. By the time they returned to the campsite, Shino and Hinata had retired to their respective tents. With the watch rotation, Kurenai was to take the first shift, so Naruto went to his tent. Shino was already in his sleeping bag, with only the top of his head visible. Why exactly do you want Hinata to do all the cooking? I assume there is a reason aside from her considerable skill, the boy said, his voice slightly muffled. I think it might make her feel better, Naruto said as he removed his jacket and unzipped his patched bedroll. He didn't bother to remove the weights. Just make sure you let her know how good it is. It was unusually well prepared, especially given the conditions, Shino agreed. So this is intended to build up her confidence. Naruto was silent for a moment as he stretched out and tried to get comfortable. I suppose so. Something's bugging her though. That family training thing seems sort of messed up. The Hyugas are a highly respected clan, Shino reminded him. Like the Uchihas were? Naruto asked, thinking about their last encounter with Sasuke. Point taken, Shino agreed. Ooh. The night passed uneventfully, and in the morning they ate the rest of the rabbit. Oddly enough, it was even better cold, and Naruto noticed Hinata blushing a little each time he made a happy sound as they ate. He watched out of the corner of his eye, hamming it up a little, and wondered why he found it so fun to tease the quiet kunoichi. After they broke camp and resumed their journey, Naruto asked his sensei for another jutsu to practice as they walked. After a moment's thought, she agreed. But only if he could perform the water-gathering jutsu 10 times without a slip. The first time, he failed on the 9th attempt, but after that he was able to produce 10 without a hitch. Kurenai-sensei agreed that he had, indeed mastered the jutsu along with his teammates, and they took a short break from walking while she demonstrated a new technique. Now this is a combat jutsu, she said in a serious voice after showing them the seals. Be very careful how you use it. This was supposedly developed in Cloud Country, by shinobi who were very impressed by the Jiyuken techniques. Rather than forcing chakra out of your hands when attacking, this allows you to convert a small amount of chakra into electrical energy, and keep it confined to your hands. If you strike an opponent while this is active, the electrical energy will arc into your target, causing some additional damage. After asking her students some general questions, Kurenai sighed and launched into a lengthy explanation of electricity and how it behaved. Naruto found it a little confusing, but tried to take it all in. After all, he might have to fight someone using electrical attacks someday. So metal armor won't stop it very well, unless it's insulated, Naruto repeated back, and don't use it in water unless I want to shock myself. Kurenai nodded. I can't believe they didn't cover basic physics at the academy. Anyo, Hinata asked, is it that important for shinobi? There is no such thing as useless knowledge, Kurenai said in a very serious voice. Then she smiled. While we walk, I will tell you how a lack of such knowledge caused a Jonin to be defeated by a very junior Chunin. Naruto understood, as his sensei told her story, that she was trying to teach them all something, and probably him in particular. What he didn't understand was why his previous teachers couldn't make their lessons as interesting as she did. He tripped and stumbled twice over ruts in the road, barely catching himself before he hit the ground, as Kurenai described the desperate struggle. When Kurenai's tale reached its conclusion and the wounded female Chunin grabbed her opponent's weighted metallic chain and shocked him unconscious, Naruto couldn't help but leap into the air and cheer in a loud voice. I'm gratified that you found the story entertaining, but does anyone remember what we were discussing? Kurenai asked acerbically. Your opponent was ignorant of the conductive properties of steel, Shino replied, and did not understand that every time he attacked you with a metallic weapon, he was inviting an electrical counterstrike. I did not say the kunoichi involved was myself, Kurenai corrected modestly. You were not. I would find it hard to believe someone not involved in the fight could recall the pertinent details, Shino replied in a reasonable tone. Kurenai inclined her head in acknowledgement, but did not speak further. Naruto practiced the seals as they walked. According to Kurenai, the jutsu required a minimum chakra 5 times larger than the water-gathering one. However, since the seals required both his hands to perform, Naruto had to discharge the electricity before he could try again. He accomplished this by stepping off the side of the path and slamming his palm into the trunk of the nearest tree. The first time he did this, Naruto was disappointed by how little the tree reacted. The bark was totally unmarked, and he began wondering if he'd put the correct amount of chakra into the technique. So the next time he tried it, he increased the chakra, but it still left the bark unmarked. Naruto frowned and pumped a little more chakra into the next attempt. There was a faint crackle when he slapped the next tree, but no other effect. Naruto scowled in frustration. Raiden. Shocking grasp. He growled and really pushed some chakra into it this time. Now, the palm of his hand glowed with a bright golden light and a crackling that would drown out angry Kikai bugs filled the air. Naruto let out a whoop and slammed his palm into a tree trunk, even as Kurenai shouted behind him. There was a bright flash, followed by a thunderous crack, and Naruto found himself picked up and flung bodily through the air. He slammed into the ground, knocking the breath out of his lungs as he slid through the undergrowth, wondering why his face hurt. A few minutes later, Naruto was sitting cross-legged on the ground, being lectured. I can't believe you could be so irresponsible. Kurenai fumed. You could have killed yourself. Anyo, Naruto said, wincing as Hinata pulled another splinter out of his cheek. The flash made him screw his eyes shut, which probably saved his eyes. His heavy jacket, gloves, and forehead protector also blocked the majority of the wooden shrapnel. He was glad of that, because the few bits that lodged in his flesh hurt badly enough. Sensei, why did the tree explode like that? Every time I hit one before that, I didn't even leave a mark. Kurenai stared at him for a moment. Naruto, trees are grounded. Small electrical charges shouldn't damage them at all. Then why did that last one explode? He asked. Because you put far too much chakra into that technique. She snapped. So much electrical current passed through the wood that it superheated the sap inside, converting it into steam, and made it explode. That's what happens when lightning strikes a tree. Really? Naruto said, smiling despite the blood smeared on his cheeks. Hinata put away her tweezers and silently handed him a damp cloth. That's great. Kurenai spun on her heel and quickly walked away. It would be great, Shino observed, provided you managed to avoid blowing yourself up in the future. Well, yeah, Naruto said as he wiped off his face. Hinata pulled out a small jar of medicinal cream, but the tiny punctures appeared to have closed on their own. She frowned slightly as she put the jar back into her bag. Naruto stood up and dusted himself off. Arigato, Hinata-chan. Hinata ducked her head and blushed at the familiar form of address. Perhaps you should refrain from practicing any more jutsus until we reach the border, Shino said as they donned their backpacks. What are you, sensei now? Naruto grumbled. He thought the Raiden jutsu had totally kicked butt. It wasn't his fault he didn't know trees would explode. No, Shino replied, but our orders are to relieve Derikatsu's team before nightfall today, and we're going to be late if there are any more delays. Naruto looked up at the late afternoon sun and cringed. Oi, let's get moving. He shouted and set off down the trail again. Ooh. The sky was beginning to darken in the east when Kurenai called a halt. What is it, sensei? Naruto asked. He hoped she wasn't going to announce that they had failed. They had to be close to the border by now. Something, Kurenai said, looking around. Hinata, she called out. Naruto spun toward his teammate who'd been on point. She was no longer there. Hinata, he yelled. Kurenai her head to the side. It's subtle, but, Naruto. Chakra pulse, she barked. Naruto realized that his sensei must have sensed a genjutsu and immediately began pushing his chakra inwards, compressing it into a small, hard ball. Whoever had done this must have cast it between Hinata's Byakugan scans. While removing Hinata before she could detect the genjutsu made tactical sense, it still infuriated Naruto. Naruto Higi. Chakra pulse. He snarled when he felt like he was about to explode. He released the pulse. The trees around them wavered as the chakra shockwave passed through them. 3 of the trees were replaced by figures in dark cloaks. An arm protruded from one of the cloaks, holding up Hinata, who sagged limply like she was asleep. Naruto was about to charge forward when Hinata's eyes shot open and her body twisted. Her hands flashed toward her captor's arm and suddenly she was spinning through the air like a doll thrown by a careless child. Hinata twisted in midair, stabilizing her tumble, and managed to land in a crouch next to Shino. Naruto stepped forward, his hands falling into a familiar seal. Kage Bunishin no, he began, but stopped when he felt Kurenai's hand grip his shoulder. How had she gotten behind him so quickly? Aren't you a little old for playing games, Darikatsu? His sensei asked in a very disapproving voice. The middle figure snorted and threw back his hood. Dark hair was drawn back into a short ponytail and even darker eyes glared contemptuously. They have you on babysitting duty, Yuahi. He drawled, smirking. Naruto ground his teeth together, but felt Kurenai's hand tighten even further on his shoulder and subsided. Her fingernails felt sharp. Hardly, Kurenai replied in a frosty tone. You've been recalled to Konoha, she said as she pulled the red sealed scroll out of her vest and tossed it to the shinobi. The man's eyes widened. Is this some kind of joke? He asked as he cracked open the seal with a small flash of chakra. No, Kurenai replied. The Hokage is tired of your bumbling. You're supposed to be securing the border, not provoking the Iowa ninjas for your own amusement. And you and these brats are going to do a better job. Have you lost your mind? Darikatsu demanded, his face growing redder by the second. We are more than sufficient to achieve our objectives, Kurenai said coolly. The man snorted. The smallest Hyuga I've ever seen, one of those bug users, and, is that, him? He asked. Naruto felt his stomach drop and he watched his teammates from the corner of his eye. He wanted to jump this idiot and pound him before he said any more, but Kurenai-sensei's hand was like an iron band around his shoulder. Yes, this is the infamous prankster Uzumaki Naruto, though his pranking days seem to be over, Kurenai replied. He understands that shinobi are bound by the Hokage's laws, no matter where they are. Darikatsu's eyes narrowed as they flickered from Naruto to his teammates. He turned his head and spat. Fine. We will report to the Hokage. Try not to get murdered in your sleep by some bloodthirsty animal, he said in a sardonic tone. Brand, Chusei, let's strike camp and leave these, shinobi, to their mission. The sooner we leave, the sooner we get some warm sake in us. A wind sprang out of nowhere, causing their cloaks to flap in the mysterious breeze. Then they were gone, with only a swirling torrent of wind-blown leaves to mark their place.